Welcome to the SDA Housing Podcast, brought to you by Ndis Property Australia. Before starting this episode, we need to provide a general disclaimer. Information contained in this podcast is general in nature only. It does not take into account the objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular person. You need to consider your financial situation and needs before making any decisions based on the information in this podcast. And you should consider seeking independent and professional advice for your personal circumstances. All right, let's begin.
Hello everybody, my name is Minh and I'm your host for today from Ndis Property Australia, and you're listening to the SDA Housing Podcast, a show that explains, highlights, guides and brings awareness about all things SDA in this ever-changing Ndis world. Today we have our repeat, I think fourth time now, Dan from Acfield from Everhomes. Hello Dan.
Hi, thanks for having me again.
No worries. Mate, today we're talking about one topic and one topic only, which is the separation of SIL and SDA in the whole of the whole provider world when it comes to SDA, and why it's so important. Dan, I know you've talked about this many times in the past at other events and other seminars, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on it for the first time on this podcast show as to your opinion, the facts and the situation, and where the NDIA is leaning towards long term on this matter. Take it away, mate.
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess it's probably less a concern of the NDIA and more probably the NDIS Commission, just in terms of managing NDIS providers and, obviously the behaviour. But look, I guess I'll start by talking about what my view is in terms of separation of the core supports and the SIL, and I guess why I hold that opinion. So I probably can guess that I think that it's important that they are kept separate. And at Everhomes, we don't actually do anything else except for SDA, and our belief is that really it should be the NDIS participants' choice as much as possible who they choose to bring into their home to help them with their daily living tasks. And I think, like, when you talk about it, it sounds pretty common sense. Like, if I was, if I have my own home and fortunate enough to have that, and, if I needed to modify my home, I would be choosing who I brought in to help me, with some daily living tasks if I needed that. And so I guess in my mind, it's not really different to that. So the SDA is really, so under a plan, it's under the same section as home modifications, but it's there because there are people, many people, that don't own their own homes, and so they're not really eligible in the rental market to receive the same sort of levels of home modifications so that they can live with increased accessibility in their housing. So therefore, there's SDA funding, which will give them a rental subsidy so that they can live in housing that's been developed in the market, which is obviously what your podcast is all about. And so this really comes from a human rights basis. Look, Australia's involved in the United Nations. United Nations have developed human rights associated with people with disabilities, which talk about the rights of people with disabilities to make decisions about their lives, including their living situation. And then that draws down into policies and guiding documents within the NDIS, which is really founded on trying to realise the UN Convention for Rights of People with Disabilities. Those policies or practice standards then talk to what should occur there. So I think there's a lot of talk about what should occur or what's best practice, but then there's a difference between what actually occurs in the market. And I think the NDIS Commission and the NDIS as a whole are really trying to ensure that there is clear separation between the two, the SIL and the core supports and the SDA.
But Dan, you're not. I'm trying to ask on behalf of our listeners.
Yeah.
What are you trying to get at? Why do you feel like it's so important to separate the two? Because can you give examples of how this would or would not work so that we can better understand where you're coming from?
Yeah, sure. I should say that there are certainly NDIS providers that provide SDA housing, so they're responsible for the bricks and mortar, and they also have mandated that they must use their same company for all other supports as well. So day-to-day living, helping wash dishes, cooking food, all those sorts of things, you must use us over here as well. So from an investor's perspective, I guess the way that this impacts, like aside from the rights and the fact that the people really should have more choice and control under the NDIS, if you don't have happy tenants, they're going to move out because, and we have tenants that literally move to us because they don't like their core supports and so they've had to move out, which shouldn't be how it is. But for whatever reason, they've made that choice and then they come over to us. And so from a commercial point of view, and I don't like to be driven by that, but I know investors want to know about this, you're interested in having long-term tenants that are happy because they've got the funding tied to them. And so, we really need to be structuring our housing environment in a way that enables them to, feel happy there and feel like that they have autonomy and choice and control over their lives. Because this is what human beings need and want. They want to feel like they have a choice and they want to have a choice. So, I guess talking to who is likely to listen to this podcast, that's certainly a perspective I want to put across as well. Is that where you're kind of leaning towards them in?
Yeah, but more to the point, I had a podcast session last week with Tanya Gomez at her event, and she said from an auditor's point of view, if the same company or subsidiary company were both the owner, SDA provider, and the care provider of the location dwelling, as long as they're given the choice to renew every year upon their expiry or renewal every 12 months, they're given the choice to continue the care provision with the same company or go somewhere else. And as long as the potential conflict of interest is actually declared upfront to the participant, that should be fine, right?
Yeah, look, absolutely. That's how it works. Is if you have a conflict of interest, how are you managing this conflict of interest? So yes, in the NDIS Commission's eyes, that's what matters. Now I'll tell you. So the NDIS Commission practice standards are what an SDA provider is required to stick to, and they actually specify in there that their right to support provision should not be limited by their choice of SDA dwelling. So they've actually put it in there. This is something that auditors look at and that SDA providers are assessed on. So they absolutely have to be managing that conflict of interest. It is entirely possible that they can manage that well. I'm just saying I don't think it's best practice because there are always going to be biases. And there are subtle ways to influence people's decisions, especially people with disabilities. If you can have all the policies in the world that talk to a conflict of interest, but you don't have an auditor in there day to day looking at how you're actually managing that. The auditor is going to come in and go, okay, let's look at your policies. I want to have a chat to some people and let's see if broadly on probabilities, just on my one day with you or whatever it is, that I can kind of best assess that you're probably following these standards. So I guess that's where my mind goes to. I think if any provider that wants to do both, there are situations in which it makes sense that you would have to do both. And sometimes you cannot actually, if you're SDA provision, you cannot get someone providing SIL in that place. It would make sense to be doing both. But what are your structures and how are you setting it up so that there is clear separation between the two? Some providers do that extremely well and others don't. And I think probably some really large ones that have been around for a long time that are large enough to have really strong separation do it quite well. But yes.
I totally agree with what you're saying, Dan, and I support what your view is. I guess a lot of the big SIL providers in the country, they clearly have even though they have the SDA registration on their license and they can do it, I've seen them definitely decline that role and they'd rather have it outsourced to someone else.
Yeah.
And
it does happen a lot like that, yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Because look, one can argue, it's compliant, we've declared our conflict of interest, they gave the participant their choice to renew or not, it's been signed, it's all done, we're all good. Yeah, it sounds good in theory, but behind the scenes, who knows what's going on there? And they are vulnerable people. Vulnerable is the key word here. And you really don't know if there's any bias or manipulation to the situation at all. So
yeah,
my advice, I'm sure your advice will be also, is to our investors, don't think just because you are engaging an SDA provider and SIL provider in one as one organisation, is necessarily the best thing for your participants. It may sometimes in certain situations, like in regional areas or whatnot. But most of the time, for best practice, as Dan keeps on saying, it's probably best to separate the two. Now, Dan, we've heard in the past from other people that the government is leaning towards the separation of the two in the future. Is that a rumor or is that a fact in your view?
Look, I think that people take pieces of information. Look, there might be something that I'm not privy to, but I haven't seen an official statement saying that, providers are not allowed to do both or a policy position aside from there's an encouragement to do that. I do
actually, Dan, in the recent SDA price review only a month ago, I saw an actual paragraph saying the government is leaning towards that position. I actually read
it. Really?
Yeah, it said so in the document. Yeah, I saw it. Yeah, even though it's not actually required, but it's definitely frowned upon, and that's where the government is leaning towards in the future. Yeah.
There you go. I've got to reread that document, Minh, clearly. That's great. Well, look, it's an interesting document because I guess it doesn't have, to put that in there, I mean, what weight does that have? I think it's more just something that they can see that providers...
Well, in that document, Dan, if you read the document in full, it says, here are the changes for SDA price guide. It's not our responsibility, the NDIA, to mandate fire sprinklers. It's not our position to do this and this and this. However, they've made comments in that document about the topic of separation of the two, Class 1, Class 3 and fire sprinklers. So they've mentioned it. It's just a hint in my view. Yeah, a hint.
Okay. There you go. Yes. So look, when I was at Office of the Public Guardian, obviously, so I was there, under Disability Services in Queensland, and then from the, saw the NDIS roll out. And so that model of providing both in the one place was the primary model and still is for non-SDA. So if you don't have SDA funding, there's no subsidy there to really get another provider providing independent housing from the accommodation in a lot of cases. But yeah, we're fortunate that in SDA that we have this opportunity to separate the two.
Dan, I want to also raise a case scenario where the two being mixed together doesn't work. I won't mention the name of the organisation. You'll know who it is. You'll know. But because they're pretty big. They are a SIL provider and an SDA provider. They're renowned for building 10, 15 robust houses in a row, side by side, in small estates in Logan and Darwin. There's a massive class action lawsuit happening in the background against them, right? Because they were making promises, here is the SDA income for this robust house of 60 or 70 grand a year, and we'll give you a proportion of the SIL revenue that we're going to generate from the SIL provision, care provision, and you're going to make 250 grand a year in revenue from this house. That's an example where they've mixed the two together of they're enticing in property investors to come in to use them as an SDA provider, and the carrot of their business model having a SIL care provision business in the background, provide the care as well, all right, to entice and guarantee revenue, and yet all along, all these houses which are being guaranteed are all sitting empty because they're all side by side in estates around the country, all empty as robust houses. And everyone's talking about it. And you probably know who it is. But the point is, that's an example where it didn't work.
Yeah, because what they're trying to do, or tried to do, was to provide essentially what investors are often seeking in large funds, etc., which is some sort of guaranteed fixed return. And it's very challenging to do that in terms of what's happening in the market and what we understand about SDA and how that funding is tied to participants. It's a high risk thing to do if you're just doing SDA. But they've kind of gone, well, if we can mix chucking in some of this, if we're doing both, obviously we're getting a lot more money for that dwelling, and then it reduces the risks for us. But I would be confident to say that the risk was still high and it has adversely affected them making that kind of decision.
Exactly. My advice has always been for the last 3 years, talking to investors, always been mindful of the potential issues that can pop up as problems when working with a SIL and SDA provider who's combined in one. Now, it could be argued, oh, no, it's okay, it's a different brand. Yeah, but you're still the same company. Company A, Company B, owned by the same directors. The point is, it must be clearly a separation of influence and manipulation, obviously.
But the other thing that occurs, and look, I haven't measured the extent to which this occurs, but I'm quite sure it's quite a dominant model in the market, is the SDA providers are not actually leasing directly to the tenants. They do have an SDA agreement with them, but they're either leasing to a SIL provider, and then that SIL provider is then subletting. So then it's actually no different, because if they want to change their providers, they have, of core supports or SIL, they still have to move out because the SIL provider has the lease, and there's that model. But even though they're separate companies, they end up being obviously really strongly tied in together. And then there are, so every SIL provider and SDA provider are required to have an agreement between each other. So it's a collaboration agreement. And sometimes that's not specified. So sometimes that agreement could be the leases I was talking to, or it could be, hey, you're mandated to use us as SDA provider. We're going to be the one, and any person that chooses your house is going to have to use us. So these are the other models that are very similar in my mind to not having separation between the two. They are better because there are still processes in which there's degree of separation. You could still make a complaint about your SIL provider to the SDA provider, and they would obviously be required to follow that process. And they would have a degree of separation, which would reduce bias. But you can see that if there are kind of the primary allegiance is to the SIL provider, then that is not ideal either. Do you understand, Minh?
Yeah, I totally do. Yeah, totally do. What other shocking stories have you heard in the past in this line of work that has created a bad situation for participants, given this lack of separation, so to speak?
Oh, okay. As a result of the lack of separation?
Yeah. I mean, when have you seen the situation become really untenable and bad for the participant?
Yeah. Look. Okay. So you hear rumours, and we mostly it's. Obviously, so there's confidentiality involved with people coming from different houses to us. So, I don't get the full story, but we do hear things. We don't do that sort of arrangement. So I guess, it's not something that we see, but we can see cases of fraud occurring in which I guess, you've got large amounts of money being tied to that participant, and maybe they don't have capacity, but the system hasn't picked up that they don't have capacity, or there's so many situations that can go wrong. You've got guardians that might be there might be some sort of degree of financial abuse occurring. You could have SDA providers claiming the absolute full amount, which is irrelevant to whether or not they've got the same SIL provider. In a way, it could happen in either situation. But they claim the whole year in advance, so then that person just can't move because they don't have any funding in their plan. But yeah, we've had a few recently that have come to us, and they talk about fraud and things that have occurred and a breakdown in that relationship and not being able to choose, or change their SIL provider. But obviously a support coordinator is bound by privacy and confidentiality. They can't tell us the full story. I would love to know more about a lot of these often, but I kind of go, okay, well, not my business.
Yeah. I guess in layman's terms to our listeners, having a SIL provider and a SDA provider on the scene for these participants in this home, it keeps each other honest, doesn't it, Dan?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a definite tangible benefit, is that you are each independent of each other. And so just that clear separation means that you're more likely to report on each other, to be honest. And that's not a bad thing. Like if you're a good provider, you're not scared of that. You're not scared of a complaint process with the NDIS Commission because you've done the right thing, or you've tried your best. Or even the NDIS Commission, if you do something that, you could learn from that as a practice learning, then you're an organisation that's open to learning from that. But if you are closed and it's all about, let's keep this internal and let's never, ever let the NDIS Commission know about what's actually occurring here, that's when abuse occurs, And the organisations definitely think about it. There are organisations out there that definitely think like that they're terrified of what might occur if somebody found out about what has happened here. And so they kind of that don't record all of their incidents, for example. You ask them to produce an incident report on, and this is going back through a long history in working and people that have experienced long human rights abuses. They haven't necessarily recorded that as they should have in an incident report, and that's because they're worried. But when you've got two different providers, that's a bit of a safeguard. That's definitely a good point, Minh, to raise that.
I get a lot of queries from SIL providers around Australia who call our office, and because we are a property-focused business, they ring us to say, "Hi, I'm a SIL provider. I am thinking about buying a property, and I want to be the SDA provider as well." Okay, so we get a lot of those inquiries.
Okay,
Dan,
I've had a few.
Yeah, true. But from that point of view, so there's two extremes here. One is where you, as a business like Everhomes, you've decided to become an SDA provider from start, and that's where you are. Whereas these guys here on the other extreme are, well, they're thinking, hang on, well, we're a SIL provider already. If we modify our license, the registration to be SDA as well, it should be that easy. And if we buy one or two or three properties, we could get more revenue and more control by being the owner and the SDA provider and the SIL provider. Yes, commercially it makes sense from a SIL perspective. I agree. Yes, it does.
If you're purely thinking about finances and nothing else, yeah.
But the challenge there with doing that kind of approach is, okay, so you built a house, you've become a registered provider now on your own house, you're a SIL, but you have minimal SDA participants on your books. So how are you going to fill up those rooms with participants when you are seen as a competitor to other SDA providers out there, as a SIL and SDA? Because the last thing they can't go out their door knocking on, "Hey, Mr. SIL provider 1, 2, and 3, we're a SIL provider ourselves and an SDA provider. Will you give us your SDA participants, put them in our houses?" And they're going to say, no.
Well, there is a barrier to collaboration. Yeah, a definite barrier to collaboration there. Yeah, because if you're going, well, let's talk to each other and see, if we might work together in the future in developing relationships. You've got somebody that's also a competitor, then it would be in the back of your mind. Yeah. Another one that I see, by the way, and you would, just on your earlier comment, is people that want to build SDA, they don't want to be the SDA provider, but they want to be the SIL provider in there. And so they're trying to get that separation between the two, but essentially mandating that they are providing the core supports because that's the most profitable section of it in their mind. But I guess they're trying to compromise on, well, I probably should have some degree of separation between SDA and SIL. So that's another variation on it. And in that situation, I've kind of had to go to, well, I think the conflict is too great. I don't think I could be involved in a project like that.
Yeah,
you have to choose to be one or the other.
Yeah. But, and just like a builder developer who does construction, they decide to be an SDA provider one day. I mean, they're not going to be able to get traction with networking with other SDA providers for participants because they're a competitor right then and there.
Yeah. Well, look, there is one benefit to that, which is the product that they're designing. If they're interested in being the SDA provider that actually runs it, and they're going from start to finish, they've got to make sure that design is really good. So automatically the thinking is a bit different in that scenario. I'm less averse to an SDA provider that wants to, I guess, being the builder. Yeah, I've worked with builders who say that they don't think that they're allowed to do that, and I haven't really looked into whether or not they can. We don't build. But if you are more or less going to be the owner or, going to be involved from the very start of that design stage because you're a developer or whatever, and then you're going to be the SDA provider later on, that is a much less significant conflict of interest in my mind than the core supports side of things in the SDA, and you don't have the NDIS kind of overlay on top of that.
Agreed. Mate, any final words of advice from you to other SIL providers out there thinking about being an SDA provider? I mean, what should they really give thought to, and what precautions should they do to make sure that there's no conflict long-term for their business and their participants? Well, any advice for you, please?
Yeah. Well, aside from what I've already spoken about, so I was thinking about this because I spoke at the conference in Brisbane last week about this issue. And I know it is a controversial topic. I am pushing boundaries of people's comfort zones here when I talk about this. And I had an interesting discussion with someone and about it who, wanted to do both, but they were in a niche and they felt like nobody else could kind of do that SIL kind of provision in their niche that they were in, which was, it's valid, in its own way, if that's true. But I reflected on it afterwards, and it's like, well, let's think about this. What does a person, that has SDA funding actually want? Because I feel like it's coming from, what does the SIL provider want? Or what does the SDA provider want? Or, who is constructing this? What about the person that's actually going to be living in there? Do they want greater choice and control over who they can bring into their housing? Or do they want it to be restricted? And to me, it's like, it's a no-brainer. They're going to say, hey, I want to be able to choose. I don't want to have to move out if I don't like my provider. And so when we frame it like that, it just seems to, like, I don't understand why we're doing it any other way, or why it would be aside from the exemptions we've spoken about, because there are practicalities associated with needing to do both. It should be the base model, and any variation from that should be a justifiable exception. So any investor looking to get into this, if you're not thinking about that tenant's core needs, you won't tenant your houses as well. And also get into it because you care about people with disabilities, and you care about the fact that you're providing them with a better life through taking part in the SDA program. And that many investors, that's a primary motivation for them. It's nice that you can obviously get some money for having done a wonderful thing through providing this housing that's much needed. But if it's just about the money for you, and these kinds of concepts are just irrelevant to you, then maybe your commercial outcome will probably be worse as well.
Here, I totally agree, Dan. And also our listeners, as Dan said, and I reiterate it, do it for the right reasons, your investment in NDIS SDA. If it is purely about the returns and the yields, and you don't give a rat's ass about other people other than yourself in your back pocket, this is not the place to be in for your investment, because SDA is not a property play. It is a business within a dwelling, okay? You cannot think of it as a traditional property investment. You can't, because there's so much at stake here. There's the SDA provider, the SIL provider, the support coordinator, the participants, the NDIA, there's yourself as an investor. There's just so many parties or stakeholders in this transaction, in this one dwelling called a house, that must be carefully managed by the SDA provider. Because put yourself in their shoes. As Dan says, he's an SDA provider who manages the funding from the NDIA, the Income from Services Australia being the pension coming through, managing the participants' expectations, the collaborative relationship with the SIL provider as well. So there's a fair bit of work there. And you don't want to put so much, not control, but power, control, influence in one organisation to have the say in the SDA and the SIL side of things for the participants. So that's my last comment. But Dan, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate your expertise in this area. We really hope that things are going to go well for you guys at Everhomes moving forward for the next 12 months in the new financial year. Yeah. Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it. All right.
Bye-bye. Cheers.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please make sure you are subscribed and following us so you can keep in the loop with all of our upcoming episodes. We would really appreciate it if you could leave us a 5-star rating, a written review, and to share this podcast with those that could benefit. Until next time, catch you on the next episode.